Good evening and welcome. My name's Carla Adey. I'm the Senior Minister of Country Club Christian Church, and on behalf of the whole church, I welcome you. Country Club Christian Church meets you where you are and walks alongside you on the spiritual journey to a life with greater meaning. And so we think that tonight is a perfect opportunity to practice what we are all about in this spiritual journey together. Tonight is really the conclusion of our centennial celebration, which we've been celebrating for the last year or so. And it's perfect that it ended up being in April of 2022 because it was the first week of May in 1922 that we moved into this church building. And so this is really a perfect completion. I'm so grateful to our Centennial Committee and to the generous family in the church who made tonight possible to bring Krista Tippett here. I'm also wanting to welcome those of you who are attending via live stream tonight. We're glad to have you and know that many of you will watch in the weeks to come. We are grateful that some of you are members of the congregation and some of you are our members and guests. And we want members and guests to know that we will be hosting other speakers in the future. We have hosted in the past folks like Wendell Berry and authors Ann Patchett and many others in the world of meaning and thought and literature as well as theology. And so if you are interested in finding out about other opportunities when guest speakers come, you will find in front of you tonight a card that looks like this. And if you're not already receiving our emails, just put your name on that. We won't send you a weekly email. We will just send you an email when we are inviting another notable guest speaker into our community to welcome you. If you do want more information, you can fill that on the back. And then when you leave tonight, there'll be a person at the door and you can drop this card in so that we'll know how to be in touch with you about future events. I want to thank Dr. Mike Graves, who is the scholar in residence of our congregation, for organizing and planning tonight's event. And he will be joining me here in just a moment as we together host a conversation and dialogue with our guest speaker. Let me tell you a little bit about the format. In just a moment, Krista Tippett will come out and she will make opening remarks. And then Dr. Graves and I will prepare some questions that we will ask to her. Some of those have been submitted in advance by some of you, and some of them are questions that we wrote. But if you have a question tonight, hopefully you picked up a card on the way in, and someone will come down and take those cards and go through them and bring them up to us so that we can ask your question as well, because we really want this to be a conversation and a dialogue. So let me tell you a little bit about our speaker tonight. Krista Tippett is a bridge builder. She built a bridge between my son and me. When my son was a young college student questioning everything about life and faith and God and himself, he called me and said, "Mom, you've got to listen to this podcast by Krista Tippett." And I said, "Isn't she cool? I listen to her all the time." And a bridge was built between us. Krista builds bridges between theology and science, between Christians and non-Christians, between the church and the unchurched, between young people and old people, between journalism and Christianity. Krista Tippett is a journalist. She created a singular space for reflection and conversation in American and global public life. She founded the On Being Project, and her award-winning radio show is heard on over 400 public radio stations across the United States, where she takes up the great animating questions of human life. Her On Being podcast has been downloaded and played more than 300 million times and has been recognized as the best podcast by multiple news outlets. It was the first podcast that I ever listened to, and though I now listen to dozens of podcasts, Krista Tippett's podcast remains my favorite. And there are often times when I finish listening to one and I hit play and restart it and play the whole thing over again. Those of you who are members of this congregation know that I frequently quote Krista Tippett and her guest in weekly sermons. She's also a best-selling author of 3 highly regarded books exploring the topic of spirituality and meaning. Her book, Becoming Wise, is dog-eared and highlighted and sits where I can closely reach it from my desk in my office. She has been honored by President Obama and by the Roosevelt Institute. She is currently at work on a new book about the human challenges and promises of this young century. It is such a great honor to welcome tonight Krista Tippett.
So, Krista, we're going to let you have the first word, and then we'll ask some questions for you.
First of all, we can't take for granted anymore that here we are, all in the flesh, not pixelated. And this was supposed to happen 2 years ago. And I just learned it was supposed to happen as part of your centennial.
Yeah.
And it's so interesting to think about, what would we have talked about then? Although one of the things that is very much on my mind, and I think it's worth us remembering, is that we were already turn-of-century people. We were already pre-pandemic, living in a time in which we had come out of one century into the next. And most of our institutions had stopped quite making sense, right? The forms that we inherited just didn't work for this world we had entered. And I really mean that. Everything from schools to prisons to healthcare to politics, and even religion, right? Church. And this is not to say that we don't need all of these parts of our life together, but it was clear that we were going to have to remake them. We're going to have to make them work for this world, for the callings of this world. And that is daunting and also an incredible creative task to have before us as a generation in time. I also was saying to Carla and to Mike that I was at the TED conference last week for the first time, which was really overwhelming. I mean, actually problematically overwhelming to be with 1,700 people. But also, I had an experience there that I've had a few times recently where you have a form that is dynamic, that is successful, but where we don't know. And especially in our successful places, we don't know how to take a breath and name the fact that between the last time we were together and now, between that time, that spring of 2020, when I was supposed to be here, and now, we're all different people, right? At a cellular level, there's infinite variety to what happened to us, what we've carried, what we've gone through, what our losses have been, large and small, to how we feel now. But we're all changed. And the world has changed, also is transformed, and yet there's an aspect of that transformation that is not realities and dynamics that are brand new, but that we see, that more of us see for the first time. How we've been living, how we don't want to keep living, how we want to get it better. So that's kind of what I had in mind when I proposed this really presumptuous title of Remaking the World. And I think that does mean for us something that I'm quite astonished by, in awe of, but also troubled by, is I think we are hardwired to normalize everything, right? And so I've noticed, even in my workplace and in all kinds of conversations culturally, people will say things routinely like, I'm not feeling good. I feel depressed. I don't know why I'm depressed, or I'm just sluggish. I don't have the energy. I'm like, do you remember what we've just lived through, right? And none of that is resolved. It's not over. We are emerging into this new reality. So I'm just actually trying a lot to be that person who says, like, let's just take in what we're carrying. This is not about walking around depressed, or, a lot of us are there's lots of reasons to be reasonably depressed. If you're depressed, be depressed. But this is not about taking a pessimistic attitude, but I think that, to me, spiritual life at its best, my quick definition of spiritual life is that it gives us the tools to befriend reality, and not an idealized reality, not the reality of movies where there's always a happy ending or where there's an ending, right? To befriend reality in all its complexity. So I was really grateful that I was, I think I was supposed to give a speech 2 years ago, and I even found, and I don't know, I probably shouldn't be saying this in public, but I even found that the whole TED Talk scene was all wrong post-2020. For people to passively sit and take in information, right? I have not felt in this time, as I've emerged from these last 2 years, that it would make any sense for me to stand up somewhere and opine. So I was really grateful to have the permission to say, I want to be in conversation. Anyway, I realize I think conversationally anyway. I do my best thinking conversationally. I learn conversationally. And so, I'm making these few remarks as we start, but then what I really want to do is just be present in this room. And again, kind of like let's be present to ourselves and to each other. Let's give ourselves permission to just acknowledge that it's been really hard, and we're still bearing all of that. And that we have been given so much work to do, right? We have been called to so much. But part of the reason that we need to get present to what we're carrying and how we live with and through that is that we absolutely, with the magnitude of challenges before us as a species, right? As in every community and every workplace, there's a magnitude of challenge, but as a species, there's so much before us. And I like the language of callings because yes, these are challenges. Yes, there are problems. But we're called to walk into them with all of the best of what we have to offer, and we're called to walk towards them because of what we know we love and what we want to build and the world we want our children to live into. I think of this as a species moment, and I think, in March, one of the most helpful conversations I had in the last 2 years was with when 2 years ago I was experiencing everybody to be having so much internal turmoil, and we were all doing it in our own way, and we all had our different circumstances and our different ways we deal and what we had to work with. And I couldn't find anybody out there talking about that. I couldn't find anybody out there talking about how hard lockdown was on us. And I think one reason we couldn't talk about that is because, like everything else, we had turned, lockdown or not, masks or not, we had to put that in our political trenches. And that stopped us from being able to just say, this may be the thing that we have to do to keep ourselves and other people healthy. And yet it's a terrible thing to have to do, because even at the moment that we're suffering, we were also alienated from the very, human contact and relationship and touch, which is how we stay sane and how we stay whole. So that's what we've been living in. And I couldn't find anybody just talking honestly about that. And I found this woman named, oh my gosh, am I going to forget her name now? Christine Runyon, who works with the nervous system, and which is the literal mind-body connection and mind-body-spirit connection. And she talked about how in the instant that each and every one of us heard the news of a virus, an unknown virus loose in the world, our brilliant bodies, which are just designed to keep us safe and keep us well, below the level of consciousness, this cascade of responses set in, this stress response. But what has been a real burden and challenge of this is that because we had this extended pandemic, right? The other cascade of processes that usually follows that, where our bodies regulate and calm down, and we know we're safe, and we get equilibrium, and we move on with our lives. We didn't get that, right? And theoretically, we have it now, but we don't. So all I'm saying about that is, I think one thing that is actually helpful in a situation like this is naming what's going on. Just like naming it, letting it be true. And this species moment also, as hard as it is, it opened us to so much. I think in March and April 2020, to me it feels like there were chapters of what these last 2 years, and they all had learnings for us. And that question that rose up in the very beginning of as we realized that the scope of this and what needed to be done just to keep things running and keep people alive was this question of what is essential and what is non-essential. That is a spiritual question, it is a theological question, it is a civilizational question. And we also, at the same time, in this country, saw that those professions that, because all of those everything that fell into that essential category had something to do with care. And that's not what we reward in our society. That's not what we structure around. So there was our first. That was our first moment of saying, oh, we have to remake the world around what we know is essential when the ground shakes beneath all of our feet. And it was a species moment in the sense that we, again, with a very different range of circumstances, but for the ground to shake beneath our feet all at once, all of us. And I think that there was a softening and an opening that happened, which is what allowed so many of us, when George Floyd was killed in my city, that event, different details, but that event has happened many, many times. And it's happened since. But so many more of us were soft and still, and we took it in, and we started asking in another way, we don't want to live this way. We can fight, and we do, and there's validity in that about how do we wrestle with this? What's the language we use? What are the forms we use? But that seeing that we do not want to live this way, this is not the world we want any children to grow up in, that's also part of this calling. How do we remake this world? But it is again really important to remember that nothing that we're reckoning with now is a new phenomenon since 2020. We've been walking into this for a long time. this world we have to remake, including all that is creative and beautiful about it that we have to work with. This has been generations in the making, and walking into these callings ahead is generational work. And that too, I just want to circle back around. It's so important that we understand that none of us is called to do this alone. Another value of getting really clear in our bodies what we're carrying is that we accompany each other and we allow ourselves to be accompanied. And there are going to be days and maybe weeks and maybe months and maybe years when any one of us has to say, I can't be hopeful right now. I don't know what it means to be loving. I don't feel empathetic. I'm not patient, right? And that's okay, because we have each other. I think I've always felt that what we're pursuing at On Being are the great questions of meaning, which Christianity certainly, and our great religious and spiritual traditions are repositories of generations of text and ritual and story and community and wisdom around these questions, but they are also just the enduring human questions. What does it mean to be human? How do we want to live? And who will we be to each other? And I feel that prior to 2020, certainly in the West, that third question, who will we be to each other, was perhaps optional, right? It was an add-on. And I think one of the qualities of the 21st century is that, and this has to do with our technology, right? It has to do with the very way that our world is connected up, is that question of what it means to be human for us is inextricable from the question of who we will be to each other. And if we look at the great challenges and callings before us, whether that is, how do we make an economy that makes sense for most people, all people, our racial reckoning, our ecological, I don't want to keep using the word reckoning, it's so kind of violent like that, right? Our ecological calling. The answers, I think in all of these great categories that we could list of what we have to walk towards, how we live into the question of who we will be to each other, how that looks, is going to be the difference between whether we survive these crises or whether we find new ways to human wholeness and flourishing. So I think I'm going to stop there.
It's a good start. I love that image of the months of COVID being chapters. Yeah. And you said, what would we have talked about 2 years ago?
Yeah.
If we had met 8 weeks ago, we wouldn't have had a war in Ukraine.
Yeah.
So how, as you think about how are we going to be to each other in the world, how are you processing what's going on there?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think we even skip over some of the chapters, because, I mean, it's like post-2020 world just keeps on giving, right? And that's it's like, we think we've gotten, because I keep wanting, when are we going to get back to that question of what is essential? And we partly don't get back to it because something else civilizational happens, right? We had the racial reckoning, we had the West Coast on fire, we forget that, our ecological crisis, right, displayed in front of us. We had an election that took all of the important things that we have to work on and put them in these political trenches and made it impossible for us to grapple with things with the complexity that they deserve on any side of anything. and then and then we got vaccines, and we kind of soldiered on, and then it really looked like the world was opening up, and then we got a war in Europe. And for me, that actually personally was a real blow. But let me just, and I will say some more about that, but I also feel like it is real, it is terrifying, it is beyond dangerous, it is tragic, and right, it's all of that, and at the same time, I feel like in this world we are in with the eyes that are open, the absurdity of it, right? It's completely absurd. And on the one hand, you have this legacy of great powers, and you have these armies, and you have these weapons, and they've been around a long time. And at another level that is equally true and real, you have one person who unfortunately has a nuclear arsenal and a great army at his disposal, who by all accounts, has been as isolated as anybody on the planet for the last 2 years, is paranoid and fearful. And as we do, we don't show fear and pain. We present anger and power, right? But it's completely absurd. I think back to the Cold War years when I was in divided Berlin, and it was terrible, but we also felt like, well, this is just the way the world is. And I don't think this generation, and I don't even think those of us who lived through those years, right? And so again, who will we be to each other? Not this. So how do we relay the foundations so this doesn't happen? And in my mind, that has to do a lot with our human condition. That's what we haven't worked on. We've got laws and treaties and nuclear arms agreements and economic interdependence. And that doesn't, we still repeat these same patterns until we change ourselves. So I think that is the great challenge of our century. For me, though, I spent my 20s, the 1980s, in Cold War Berlin. And I remember living, knowing that, even though it was at that point, there were lots of reasons to think that it wouldn't happen, but living in a place where the Russian tanks rolling in always felt like it was within the realm of possibility. And I remember Chernobyl. I remember being downwind from what at first was this mysterious radioactivity that nobody knew where it was coming from or what it was. And for me, in those first days when Chernobyl was occupied, I had this body memory trauma around that. And I think the bigger thing I'll say about it is the experience I had of being in divided Berlin and being in that Cold War world, and nobody being able to imagine that it could end. Nobody, right? The president of Germany was out of the country the day the Berlin Wall came down. There was a lot happening, there was a lot of fluidity, there were weird things going on, but nobody imagined, our imagination was too small. And the world changed completely. And that experience has formed me ever since. And even though you could say on one hand, it feels like what's happening in Ukraine now is, in fact, the undoing being undone, it's not. It's devastating. It's not. But what I learned from walking through that in such a personal way and loving people on both sides of that wall, is I know that at any given moment there is much more possibility than we see, and much more There's much more happening than we can see, and there's more possibility than we can imagine. And in these years I've had of my conversation on radio, people who shift the world ask the what if question, right? Like the hope that is muscular, which is the only hope I'm interested in, that actually shifts reality, is also work of the imagination, not in the sense of wishful thinking, but in the sense of saying, you know what, this is reality, and I insist that it doesn't have to be this way. And then you throw your life at that insistence. So I don't know, for me, that's been such an incredible thing that I've held on to, and it still is. And yet, I think, maybe I would say that what's happening in Ukraine is the worst possible. It does also reflect this other conviction I have, that when we don't pay attention to the human condition, the human drama, when we haven't really invested in how do human beings get out of fear, and then become able to access our higher capacities, our creativity, our capacity to love in a way that is practical, that also shifts reality, we will find ourselves back in the dark drama of the human condition.
So, Krista, when you were in your 20s in Germany, the world was going through this big shift.
Yeah.
And you went through a big personal shift.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you could say something about that. And also, the world is now going through this big shift with COVID and the war in Ukraine, and you're also going through another shift you just announced recently in your own path. And so I'm just wondering if you could say something about how that shift happened for you personally and how it's happening now. And I know you're always asking other people these questions, but I think they would love to hear what was happening inside of you during those moments.
Yeah, I mean, and I'll tell kind of the very human dimension of that story. You know, I mean, I had grown up in a small town in Oklahoma, like not that far from here, and I didn't even really know that there was much of a world beyond Oklahoma and Texas. I mean, I barely knew kind of north. But then strangely, I ended up in divided Germany. I was kind of fearless, I think, once I got out. I was just like, okay, show me what else there is. So I wandered into being the New York Times stringer in West Berlin without any promise of a salary. In fact, I never had a salary, but without any promise that I would write anything. I turned out to be pretty good at it, but what I was actually really good at is getting people to talk to me. And just seeing who was out there doing what and where the energy was and where the generative things were arising. And so at some point, so I was actually pretty good at reporting, but I hated it because so when you're doing that kind of reporting, you basically, and the people who are good at this thrive on this, like you wake up in the morning to say, what is the world gonna throw at me that I covered today? But I love like getting into a story, and then I wanted to do the same story and go deeper the next day. And you have to turn your back and move on. And so eventually our chief diplomat in West Berlin hired me because he saw that I had gotten to know all these people. I had gotten to know this new Greens party, which was very radical and not taken very seriously, which is now, has for years been one of the major political forces in Germany. And of course, the environmental movement wasn't a thing then. I knew people across the wall, and so he basically hired me to kind of know who I knew and what I knew, and to help them understand what's happening. I was 25. So I took that job. That diplomat, who was a wonderful person, left, and the person who took over from him and asked me to keep working for him was a nuclear arms expert. And I ended up, those next couple of years, sitting around these tables with these mostly men, I mean almost all men, who were sitting around these tables, you know, moving these missiles. There were 6,000 medium-range missiles in Germany at that time. And they were pointed at everybody's cousins and grandmother across in the other Germany. And it was all ego. I thought, oh my God, this is so exciting. This is where life and death are being, you know, where the fate of the planet is being decided. And these are the people that our livelihood and, you know, the future of freedom and democracy is in their hands. And they weren't there for that. And I was this young, idealistic person, and it was really morally devastating. But I didn't say that to myself for a long time because it was also so exciting. And my resume looked so amazing. And, you know, it's like, how can I be questioning this career path? But on the other hand, I was asking because, you know, are these the people I want to be like or with when I grow up? And so I kind of went away and left Berlin, and this was in 1988. It was 9 months before the wall came down, which of course, if I had had any inkling that it could happen, I would not have left then. But, and so, you know, I got quiet for the first time. I was fluent in German, but I had never had a conversation with any spiritual or religious vocabulary. I could talk to anybody about nuclear arms negotiations. I got quiet. I started doing something. I eventually realized I was praying. It was like that entire side of myself had been kind of in a compartment. Mm-hmm. And I started naming the fact that I was in a moral crisis. And I didn't, and it's not like I knew what I was going to do about it, but fast, you know, 2 years later, or 18 months later, 2 years later, I went to divinity school. Mm-hmm. But I didn't go actually very purposefully. I didn't think I was going to be ordained. I just had discerned that the only part of the human enterprise that was asking the questions I wanted to be asking, which is about the human effect of things. And how do people, you know, the other dynamic of Berlin is that it was really like this great social experiment, because you had this one city, one people, one history, one language, and you split it down the middle, and on this side, and you have two completely opposite economies and political systems, and ways of telling the same history they'd all lived through. And yet part of my moral, there were two kind of levels of moral confusion. One was what I was seeing in the world of real power. And the other was that I loved people on the western side of the wall, I loved people on the eastern side of the wall, and I saw that people in the East who had nothing could create these lives of incredible dignity and beauty and intimacy, and that it was also equally likely that if you lived in West Berlin where you had everything, you could be really shallow. And so that is I think that question of studying theology. So what is this? How is it that we make meaning? What is it? How is it that we craft lives of meaning? And that is, to some extent, about the conditions and circumstances we're given, but largely it's just what we do with them. And there was no other part. Where else? What else could I have gone to study? I just wanted to think theologically.
Wow.
Yeah.
The best kind of thinking.
What?
The best kind of thinking.
Yeah.
You know, when we were in Carla's office.
It's a set of questions also, as much as it's you know, it's the questions, yeah.
When we were in Carla's office, I mentioned how during World War II, people like Reinhold Niebuhr would be on the cover of Time. So the public was hearing a theological voice. I mean, he was teaching at a seminary.
Yeah.
Now, in the war in Ukraine, if you turn on the TV, it's politicians, journalists, economists. This is what the supply chain is going to do. It seems like you're in some ways the Reinhold Niebuhr, or curating the voices of the Reinhold Niebuhrs of our day to ask theological questions. Is that, I mean, do you think of it that way?
It's a little bit intimidating. You know, I think when I first started the show, when I first started theology in the 90s and then started the show in 2000s, there were still people saying, like, where is the Reinhold Niebuhr of our day? And what they mean is, like, where is that public theological voice?
Right.
I think what I've understood now is that in this world, we don't have single voices, you know, that have the platform. But we have many voices. And they're in communities, right? They're close to where people are living. And, you know, the other problem with Reinhold Niebuhr and Paul Tillich, who else? I mean, King was a public theologian. And we don't think of him that way. Bonhoeffer, yeah. I mean, they're mostly, again, they're all men.
Oh, yeah.
And they're mostly white. And they're mostly actually German theologian. Yeah, from a German tradition. And I do think it's true that what I feel like what I've been watching and investigating these 20 years is public theology in our time. And it is multiply articulated, it is dispersed, it is every gender, it is every race, it is every age. And it is sometimes not in any recognizable way religious. Right. And yet those moral questions and those theological callings, which is about ultimate things, that voice is out there, but it's expressed so differently. One thing that I think about a lot is, because I did come out of journalism and I am a journalist, you know, one of my moral confusions now is about how journalism, which I think most people who go into journalism are quite mission-oriented, you know, they want to make the world a better place. But the form that we have, which is so sophisticated at telling the terrible stories, like investigating what is catastrophic and corrupt and dangerous. There's a place for that, to be sure, but it's not the whole story of our time. The whole story also has generative creativity. It has things that are working. It has people who are building what needs to be built. It has care in abundance. And I think, like, that's where I'm looking for kind of public theology, that moral, thoughtful voice that resists the simplifications and therefore resists the polarization and is taking on the complexity of what is and has a vision of what can be. It's just everywhere, but so I think for me, part of my calling as I think about it is how to make this generative landscape of our time, and I just think probably all of you are on it with me. We're all on this generative landscape, but the people on this generative landscape feel more alone than they are and than the world needs them to be. They're working, you know, upstream against forms and systems that aren't aligned with where we need to go, but we're there, right? We're trying to push this forward, and so I want to try to think about how do we make this generative landscape not just visible in its power to, you know, externally, but that we all feel more like an ecosystem than like a bunch of You know, it's this silo world that came out of the 20th century, right? Like it's how alone we feel and how isolated is a manifestation of this world of, you know, the individual, the institution, and, you know, science to me, as is clear in the show, is such a companion. We are learning about the nature of vitality, and vitality is about biodiversity, and it is about ecosystem. It is not about strong individuals. It's not about top-down leadership. And none of that is working anymore.
So I have two follow-up questions, one about public theology leading into science and the other about polarization. So let me start with the public theology science question, because you just mentioned that. So I think part of what I wrestle with is when we do hear the voices of religion in journalism or in the public sphere, they don't always resonate with who I am as a religious person. And I think you have given religion a good name in so much of what you've done in conversation with people and the way you speak. But science, I think, is a good example. So I hear many people all around me disconnecting Christianity from science. They think if you're a good Christian, you can't take science seriously. I don't know why that still exists, but it still does. And then when I read serious thinkers in the Christian tradition, women like Elia Delio or men like Rob Bell, who take seriously quantum physics and what's happening in cutting edge science, it seems like their theology is expanded by science, not inhibited by it, and vice versa. So I know on your show you've interviewed scientists who are not religious, and you've interviewed scientists who are religious. And so I'm wondering how you see the intersection of science and religion, and what are we missing? What are we not doing to say that we are conversation partners?
Yeah. It's such an example of how the narrative that we all have in our heads, even if it contradicts what we know, is shaped by the way the story gets told in certain places, right? Because even people who say they're anti-science really value that MRI machine that diagnosed their mother's brain tumor, right? Like even when there's a hostility set up, it's only talking about certain things. And I just, so journalists love to pull out the religious person who hates science. It's such a niche story, actually, right? It's not true of all Christians. It's not true of most denominations. It's really only in this country that, right? It's only in this country that and it's in certain kinds of Christianity. It's not really a Jewish story. It's not really a Muslim story. I mean, there are exceptions, but, and yet we generalize in this country about the science-religion debate. I don't know if anybody here heard, I interviewed a few months ago Katharine Hayhoe.
Yes,
who
we did a group with her.
You did what?
She was one of the podcast groups that we did.
I mean,
listen to
and
it.
I love finding people like that. Now, I think, so she's actually one of the major climate, she's an atmospheric something. So one of the most important scientists working in this, I actually don't like to use the word climate because it's just such a diminishment of what we're talking about, right? So, and I think it also is a loaded word, and it actually sparks the divisions. It kind of but yeah, she is one of the people who is working on this science. So let me just say, specifically what hers is, not climate science, but she's basically done just the most important work working with cities on what is the infrastructure that we have to put in place when we know that water levels are rising? Like, how are sewers going to work, and water supplies? It's like all these things that are very human and existential, and we all care about, and we all want and need them to function. So even to say she's a climate scientist, and then when I explain to you what she does, right, it's this life-giving work. And nobody's going to complain about that science when the sewers don't fail, right? But we don't talk about things we don't let the complexity in. And also one thing people do on this, side of the dialogue where we like the word climate is, if people aren't willing to use the word climate, then we kind of simplify them. And we need to spend a lot more time just talking, and this is what Catherine Hayhoe said. So she is this major climate scientist. She is an evangelical Christian. Her husband is a pastor. She lives in Texas. And she spends a lot of her time as what I would just say, kind of a bridge person, going around and talking in churches, in conservative churches, where there is sometimes, not always, this assumption, right? This narrative has been internalized, that these two things are at odds. And, one of the things that she said about the question she gets, she because she's a scientist, she did some kind of massive diagram spreadsheet of all the questions she got. And she found that the single question that recurs most frequently is, what gives you hope? And actually last week at TED, I also interviewed somebody who I'm going to resist calling a climate scientist. She is a marine biologist. And this came up this comes up in every conversation I have now with people working on this issue. I think, again, to come to the human condition level, which is about dealing with ourselves and other people not as we wish ourselves to be, but as we are, which is very complicated and contradictory and inconsistent. And is that fear, anybody here read the Dune novels? Not the movie. I didn't really like the movie. Fear is the mind killer, right? Fear is just one of the most powerful forces in our world, in our brains, in our bodies. It's embodied, and I think it is the single ingredient that is most prominent in every single one of these, any of these issues we could raise where we're so polarized. What is at play is fear. We do not rise to our best selves when we're living in fear. And I hear that behind this question. Okay, I've got this science. I get it that you're a good person. What gives you hope? It's like, and this came up with the marine biologist this week too. On this issue, I even hate the word issue because that also just collapses things and it makes it cerebral. On this aspect of our life together, we have to get really fluent if we want to motivate ourselves and others to walk into a future of life. We have to get mobilized around what we love. Why? Why do we want to save the planet? Is it because of the CO2 levels? No, right? That's the thing we argue about. But this is our home, and it's beautiful, and it gives us life. It is life. And so, so I think, and to give people hope is strangely, it sounds so contradictory if you think in terms of arguments. But to say, we're not learning all of this to become demoralized. We are learning all of this so we can claim our agency to save and build what we love.
So let me ask a follow-up, and then I'm passing to you.
Sure.
And then hopefully we'll have some questions coming from all of you as well.
If you haven't held up your card and you want to ask a question, we've got some folks that'll grab them and bring them up here.
Yeah. So you use the language, I want to hold on to that phrase about love. Say it again. Not motivated by love. you said.
Yeah.
So my question is, you mentioned Catherine Hayhoe is a bridge builder.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that the church is uniquely poised
Yeah.
because we are motivated by love. That's why we exist, to be
Yes.
a bridge builder in this age of, you talked about putting things in the trenches, in the
Yeah.
polarization during the election. What do you see as the opportunity for the church to walk into that space, to be the bridge builder in our society?
Yeah. Well, I mean, a couple things come to mind. It's a big question, so just a couple things come to mind. One is that I think this matter of having love as a core belief and principle is really serious. And the love that is in the Bible, that is in Christian tradition, is exceedingly practical, right? It's not even a feeling. It's what you do. And you know, even in the Greek, in the New Testament Greek, there are many words for love, right? There's philia, there's the love of friendship, which is actually a force that we really underestimate in the world and also in how history, how change happens. There is the eros, right? There is the love that we feel, and there is agape, and I think there are other Greek words for love, right? But so I'm kind of, what I'm saying by that is, I think one thing that's happened in my lifetime is that churches have kind of shied away from really wearing on their sleeves. And you know, these things that are believed in, but belief is actually not the right word. It's like, what do we stand for? And not only that, it's what are we sophisticated about, right? What is our particular intelligence? Because love is an intelligence. And actually, we all know this in our lives. Like love, you hopefully keep learning to do it better. Right? It is a skill as much as it's, you know, this kind of inborn, innate, instinctive capacity. That doesn't take us very far. And even with the people we're closest to, even with our children or our partners or our colleagues, who we love, most of the time, we may not be feeling that, right? But we're doing it. And then the feelings come back again, right?
Hopefully.
And they keep us going, hopefully. So what I would say is, what if the church, because I actually find that this word love is very magnetic to 21st century people. It's very magnetic to the young. And they understand that it's something muscular. So what if the church really got serious about love? And what do we know about love? And what does it mean? And then, you know, not be worried about sounding impractical or less serious than the political language. I don't know what this would look like, what I'm proposing, but it's coming out of me. And the other thing I want to say, so this is you hear that I think that words are some of the most powerful things we possess, the words we speak, and we're so unaware of that. We walk through our days like we have the power to make someone's day, to break someone's day in any given moment, a stranger, someone we care about, and we don't even consider this power, right? How we use words as weapons in this society, but also words. Words can build up, words make things possible, they can calm, right? In a world of fear, to be a calming force might be the most impactful thing you could do in any moment. So I'm just saying that because, like, I'm going to say, I didn't say bridge builder.
Yeah.
I said bridge person.
Bridge person.
So what I mean by that is, and this is not what everybody's called to, but some of us have it in our lives, in our lived experience, and I feel like I became a bridge person in a way I never expected after 2016, because I had basically left my small town in Oklahoma and never looked back. But I am so grateful that, I live in this blue state, right? Minnesota, north. But there is this girl from Oklahoma in me. In my body, I cannot look at a place colored red on the map and have some kind of idea about all the people there, some kind of dehumanizing stereotype. Like, I know that there are all kinds of people living all kinds of lives just trying to get by. And they may have voted this way or that, but there's complexity and there's humanity. And so to be a bridge person, and so Catherine Hayhoe is a bridge person, and literally, you can see it physically, like she has one leg in the world of atmospheric science, and she has one leg in the world of evangelical Christianity. And she is stepping into that. You almost get to be a translator, right? And you're kind of translating this world to that world and back again. And I think I think absolutely Christians could do that also by saying, yeah, sure, I voted a certain way, or I have this opinion on that issue, and I'm a Christian. I love is what it's all about. So what does that look like in practice?
Okay, so while I'm getting these.
You want me to go through those while you
No,
do yours?
it's okay. We had an audience question submitted ahead of time, okay? So I'll read these in just a second. This came from somebody who was looking at the On Being page and said, there's a page, start here, this is your first time to On Being.
Yeah.
Do you know that? So,
yeah, I do, but tell me what they found.
well,
I may not remember.
their take was, it looks like the two themes that stood out the most were beauty and justice. And I wonder if you feel like that's an accurate reflection, or do you have other words you would add, or how you might talk about those things together?
Yeah, I love that. I think definitely beauty. I think beauty is a moral value. I think so John O'Donohue, who was a Irish poet and theologian and philosopher I interviewed, his definition of beauty is my definition of beauty, which is, and it's a way to distinguish between what I'm talking about when I talk about beauty, as opposed to, as he said, glamour, right? He said beauty is that in the presence of which you feel more alive. And I think it's also like, this is relevant to this conversation about ecology, right? The natural world. That's why we save it, right? That's why we walk towards this crisis with care and with love. Justice is an interesting one, because justice is also a word. It's a hugely important word. It's a critical word. It's also a word that has gotten hijacked a bit. Not hijacked. It's a word that sends people into the fight part of their brain. And so I always want to not assume that that the word justice alone connotes everything that I mean when I talk about justice, right? In fact, just a little bit similar to this conversation about crisis and love, I would say the single most interesting and really very persistent message that's coming out in my conversations in these last couple of years about justice is the absolute necessity of joy to power justice. And again, it's like, what do we love? What is that world we want to see that we're going to throw our lives behind? I'm just getting ready to interview Adrienne Marie Brown. Are there some people here? Yeah, okay. Thought it might be over in this corner here. Yeah, and you're right. It's yes, there are things to fight for, but that's not the whole story. Why do we fight? And what are we fighting for? We've been doing this this series that we call The Future of Hope, which I'm so excited about, and we're going to continue it. I'm basically inviting former guests on the show to interview somebody else, to have a conversation that they've wanted to be having. And the one that is actually going to be on the air this week, Thursday, is with Ai-jen Poo, who created the National Domestic Workers Alliance, which doesn't sound, I don't know, it sounds very official, but she's basically, for 20 years, this whole thing about caregiving that a lot of us woke up to in March 2020, she started working with nannies and domestic workers and caregivers to the elderly, this huge workforce of millions of people who are in homes and in care settings, and they were not afforded the basic rights, like the right to any days off, the right to a weekend. They got written out of all of the laws of the 20th century, partly because they were mostly Black, right? These are some of these shameful stories. And these were the essential workers when the pandemic hit. And so anyway, that's what she does. She has seen this caregiving crisis coming. She's the most hopeful person I know, and she's one of the best fighters I know. And Ai-jen interviewed Tarana Burke, who started the Me Too movement. And those two, these are women leaders, next generation leaders, starting some really defining movements of our time. And they're different movements from the previous movements. And they are so, where they've been coming, what they end up in, their friends, right? Again, this friendship, right? Like that friendship has helped them do what they've done. And they talk so much about where they're evolving to with, actually, Tarana Burke is talking a lot about grace. She's talking a lot about grace, revolutionary grace. And like they're kind of at the next stage of their movements, and like the grace we have to give ourselves, the grace we have to give others if we are going to evolve together.
Wow.
So all of that comes to mind when I think justice. Yeah.
Good, it's good. So here's a question that was submitted. When was the last time you were amazed?
Oh, look, I'm not, so I don't know why I feel like my children have always been my my reality check, right? Like people will say, oh, your mother, she's so serene. And so like a lot of things you might imagine about me if you just listen to the show are probably not true or not true a lot of the time. But amazed, I am so often amazed. There's so much to be amazed about. I'm sure that if I talked to every person in this room, there would be something amazing, whether you realize it or not. Human beings, we are amazing. This world is amazing. It's amazing and it's strange, right? Like that amazing is not always beautiful. But it's amazing.
Can I ask a follow-up question to that one?
Absolutely.
So when he asked you when's the last time you were amazed, the first thing you said is my children. Mm-hmm. And there's a question that came from the audience about that. It was submitted earlier, and it is, what influence has being a mom had on your interviewing, your worldview, and your spiritual formation?
Oh, well, I just think being a parent, it just, it does, I feel like when I became a mother, you realize there's this whole parallel universe. There's been, and including like all this sleeplessness that nobody was complaining about, right? It's changed everything about me. It would just, I don't know who I would be if I weren't a mother,
Sure.
right? It's almost like that.
Yeah.
It's hard to talk about.
Yeah.
I do think it breaks you open, right, again, in beautiful ways and in, ways that you think you can't survive.
Right. Yeah.
And so anything that does that shapes you.
Sure.
I mean, my children are now 23 and 28. So now I'm just having to get to know them all over again as adults.
Sure. Yeah.
But I realized we've been pulling out some of the kind of most beloved shows, and when is Mother's Day? Is it soon? I think for Mother's Day we're going to do Sylvia Boorstein, who's this Jewish Buddhist teacher. And there's this moment, and I forget things, and then I just listened again because there's a moment where I said to her, I had this experience with my daughter yesterday, who I think at that time was 14, and she said to me, my daughter said to me, "Is this one of those do as I say, not as I do moments?" So I just think my children have kept me so grounded and so honest, and at times to exhaustion.
Yeah. Sure. Yes.
So here's a question. Out of all your conversations you've had, is there one thing you continuously hold on to or return to?
Of the conversations?
Mm-hmm. It's a tough one, isn't it?
Yeah, so if I start thinking about it, there will be too many. I mean, one of them is that John O'Donohue definition of beauty. I don't know, I think I'll just land with Sylvia Boorstein. She said to me, our children are rarely listening to us as much as we want them to be listening to us, but they're watching us so much more closely than we would really like for them to be watching us. And I think that's true in general. I think it's even a function of how we are basically animals, right? We're creatures. And there's so many ways that we're picking up things from other people and communicating things to other people that are not verbal. I prepare so deeply for my interviews because a conversation starts before any words are spoken, and even if I'm on headphones and somebody is thousands of miles away on headphones, we are picking up, we are getting, you very quickly at this bodily level know this is somebody I can open up with, or this is somebody I have to defend myself with, or I need to be presentational, or, oh, they get me. And then everything in you relaxes. And literally that can happen before any words are spoken. So I think it's a good thing for us to remember too. I mean, that's why I say, for a lot of these things that we have to learn to talk to each other about and listen to each other. Curiosity is really a moral muscle. It sounds like a really simple thing, but we have basically unlearned curiosity, just like we have unlearned listening, right? Listening is a basic social art, but we are trained in unlistening. And we're really heavily trained in presenting our opinion. There's a place for that, but we're not trained for listening, which is not about being quiet, it's about being present. And so the reason I say that is we're going to have to just practice, and it's inner work actually to get curious. So we need to kind of learn to work on ourselves before we ever enter into an interaction or a debate or a potential to be a bridge person. Mm-hmm. Because if I'm faking creativity, if I'm just saying, I'm curious, and I ask a curious sounding question, right? We can all ask curious sounding questions. But I know at a physical level that you don't mean it, and it's not safe or reasonable for me to open up to you the way you're asking me to open up to you. But let me give another moment, because this is important. You know, when I interviewed Mary Oliver, a lot of people read Mary Oliver. I mean, Mary Oliver is Mary Oliver, but like, she smoked the whole time. And I just wrote about this in our newsletter, because I hadn't ever written about it, but why that feels important to me is because no one is a saint. No one is a hero. And I have absolutely no tolerance and no interest in putting anybody up on a pedestal or having myself put up on a pedestal. We are all just like humans. We're struggling. And we're just doing the best we can. And I just love like meeting Mary Oliver, who you know, wrote such beautiful poetry about the natural world, and so wise and so gentle, although there's a fierceness there too. And meeting her in her, you know, I went to her, first of all, it was a big deal to get to interview her, and, you know, my producer wrote me on my way and said, she wants to smoke during the interview, are you okay with that? I'm like, am I really gonna say no? It's off. And so she like inhaled deeply while we talked, and she was wearing a New England Patriot sweatshirt. And she was so, like, you know, down to earth, doesn't really get at it. And it was so, to me, that was just, that is how it is.
So we're heading down the home stretch, and we have some
I'm giving long answers.
No, that's good. So we have some closing questions. Are you going first, or am I going first?
I think you are, but I'm feeling sad because I've got like 10 more questions.
I know. So the notion of remaking the world, or in the Jewish tradition, tikkun olam, to heal the world, to repair it, that implies we have to do something. And this is a really hard question, and some people had submitted as well. And this happened when we did the class on a Christian response to the war in Ukraine. People were saying, what can I do? So not just the war, but not just COVID, but the economy, whatever it is. How do you respond when people say, what am I supposed to do? Because so many people feel powerless. They know more than they can connect to. What do you...
Oh, it's such an important question, because if we don't know how to think that through, we will do nothing. And it is so reasonable right now to be paralyzed, right? There's just too much to do. There's too much to care about. There's too much to despair about. And so, you know, all I can say to you is one thing that has come through with wise people I've interviewed this year is just really this very simple statement, but I think it's important, like, we're not all called to do everything. We have to figure out what is our work to do. And Brian Stevenson, I think, who is this lawyer who's worked with, he's worked with people on death row, but really people who are invisible. And he's now really getting into, in Montgomery, you know, just kind of letting the story, our full story, be told, and letting us stand before our full story. And so Brian Stevenson says that to the question, because, you know, he has all kinds of things that he would tell you to get involved in, and he really believes that hope is our superpower, and it is what helps us get out of bed in the morning, and it helps us stand up when somebody else says sit down. But we don't begin, the answer to the question is not get hopeful. He says that his counsel for how do I move towards that question, what do I do, is to get proximate. And I think that means, and I think that starts to focus in the fact that there are some things I can't get proximate to in my life. But you can ask, what in my world that I can see and touch do I not know enough about? Do I not know enough? Do I not have enough human connection to be able to even know what helping or being involved would look like? I think the way I also come at this, which is a little bit in that answer, is a little bit in what I just said. But so I am a big, if you've listened to On Being, you've probably heard me quote Rilke about living the questions. I mean, Rilke, I think, is such an important, Rilke, who also was a turn of century person, Rilke writing in the early 20th century, which, aside from our ecological crisis, really still had us beat on refugees, wars, and pandemics, right, and economic crisis. But Rilke said, when we have questions that we cannot yet answer, the answers are simply not at our fingertips. And if we pretend they are, which is what we do in this society a lot, we come up with a solution anyway, right? Or we come up with an action plan anyway. And we want it to happen right now. And we waste a lot of time rushing into undiscerning solutions. So when we have questions, and I think you could say that living in the year 2022, we are standing before vast, unanswerable questions, but they're existential. And so he says what you do is you hold the question itself. You love the questions themselves. He said you love the questions like they are locked rooms or books written in a very foreign language. And you live the question, and then perhaps one day without knowing it, you live your way into the answer. Now, that is poetic, but it is also a way to live. And I have found that if you are faithful to your questions, they are faithful back to you. This is not a quick thing, right? This is not, I'm saying, ask the question today and next week you'll have the answer. This is like, and I feel like, again, the questions before us are so vast, they're so civilizational. They are going to be there for the rest of our lifetimes. So I would say, tell yourself, now I'm going to take a year, right? Change is not fast. If transformation is not fast, right after transformation, we also have to slow down. And so say, I'm good for the next year. I'm going to live this question. What is my work to do? And start with the world you can see and touch. And it's probably, none of us is going to solve the war in Ukraine. Like, I spent 2 weeks not sleeping after that war started, and I finally realized that I was not helping the people of Ukraine by not sleeping, and I was not stopping Vladimir Putin from launching a nuclear attack because I was worrying about it. And it's not that I don't care, but there's a lot of that. So it's not that we have to get, because the problem is if we care about everything, we get numb. So in a way, we're going to have to say, not that I'm numb to that, but that's not my work to do. What is my work to do? And live that, walk around with it. Let it be a really active investigation. And flex that moral muscle of curiosity. And then maybe I'll come back in a year and you can tell me what you
We would love that. We would love that. So Krista, this is the culmination of our centennial. So we've been thinking about where do we go from here as a community. And I'm thinking of something that you said about hope, how it is brokenhearted on the way to becoming wholehearted. And you said earlier that it's understandable that sometimes people don't have hope, and we have to accept that sometimes that's just where we are. Whether we're people of faith or we're not people of faith, sometimes we can just get to that hopeless point. But tonight, at this moment, as you sit here, what hope do you have for this congregation, for the Church Universal, and for the world?
Well, I feel a lot of hope just sitting with you here. I mean, I do feel like we're present to each other in a different way. Like really, we've shifted at a cellular level, and I don't know that I've been in many rooms where everybody wasn't wearing masks, for a while, so like I can see faces, and the energy. We have a different energy. I really believe, and I am vindicated. Like, I know the terrible stories. We all read the same terrible news today, and if we were on Twitter, we read the same terrible thing, and there's so much to be worried about. And there's so much that's just so beautiful that's also happening all the time, and we are strange, and life is strange, but there is so much goodness, and there is so much social creativity going around. And, the new generation of people coming up, and there are a few of them over here, and they know who Adrienne Marie Brown is, they've got intelligence in their bodies that it just literally, they're born with intelligence and instincts that those of us who've been living for a while don't have. And we cannot say to them, the world will be in such good shape in your hands, right? Like, we have to walk alongside them because we also have different kinds of intelligence. But I just feel like if one resolution were to, look, and I think that the fear that's going around, the fear place our world is in, the fear which reduces us, and which gets in the way of our full cognitive and capacities, and even our heart capacities. That place in our brains is also the place that gets really riveted by bad news instead of good news, right? Like, there's something biological going on, and I think we have to evolve as a species out of that, and I actually think that we can do that. So we have to override that a little bit by saying, oh yeah, look, I'm exactly the same. If I get a list of 10 articles and here's the weird one about the bizarre murder or whatever that happened, right? I will click on that because it's that same thing in us where our bodies tell us to take care of ourselves. We're looking for threat. We are wired to do that. So this is not a huge ask, but just to start taking as seriously when you see somebody doing a really beautiful thing, or a really good job, or really rising to their highest human potential, really living in care. That is literally kind of an evolutionary move we can make. And again, just the way we talked about how if what we have to muster to meet these great cosmic challenges is we have to muster the right kind of outrage, but we have to muster love, and we have to muster joy, and we have to muster a real seriousness about what we care about and why we care about. This is really important work. So there was this psychological study that intrigued me a few years ago, and it was about gratitude, and it was in the New York Times at Thanksgiving because they needed a hook. And it was about a study about how gratitude, they can measure. These are the amazing things science is learning now. Like gratitude, people sleep better, they're healthier, they have peace of mind. And one of the ways they talked about, and then they made a joke, right? They said, this is why brothers-in-law don't kill each other over the Thanksgiving table or something. It was ridiculous. Because they do sometimes now, right? But what they said, this is the way they described it clinically. What is the move people are making for this gratitude that helps people be in the world in a different way? And they called it taking in the good. And I think that is a really helpful, you can walk around with that. So when I see the good, I take that into, it has pride of place right there on the shelf beside the terrible, that was already on the shelf, right? It's a way to live, and it's a way that we can help each other live.
It's very helpful.
So during the centennial year, a little over a year ago, we had Miroslav Volf from Yale, your alma mater, and David Brooks from the Times, and who's also with the Aspen Institute. Yeah. And I bring that up because their mission is healing the social fabric. Yeah. And it just strikes me that that's one of your gifts. And you mentioned how we're present to each other in the room. And so we want to thank you for being present and also you being present. So could you show your appreciation to Krista?
Which way? That way?
What are you saying?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Be safe.